Fellow Sadzaitas, when you walk around town today, you will see car dealerships everywhere. You can buy almost any car you like. And if your dream car isn't available in Zimbabwe, you can simply import it. But there was once a time in Zimbabwe when all of this was just a dream. A time when owning any car was a true symbol of social status and sometimes a privilege. A time when the demand for vehicles far outweighed supply, leading some naughty government ministers to become car dealers under the cover of darkness. You see, during these days, if you wanted a brand new car, you could be on a waiting list for years. But if you were a government minister, you didn't need to worry about being on some waiting list. You could simply use a government privilege to skip the queue. In fact, you didn't just skip the queue. You turned the queue into a business opportunity. Government ministers became car dealers. Imagine buying brand new vehicles at cheap prices from a state-owned company and then reselling those vehicles to desperate buyers at double the price, sometimes even triple the price. And this wasn't happening decades after independence. It was happening less than 10 years after independence. And the culprits were senior government officials and party bigwigs, the very people who had promised to build a clean, corruption-free Zimbabwe. And when the truth finally came out, careers were ended, and one man took his own life. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Willowgate Scandal, Zimbabwe's first high-profile post-independence corruption scandal. Fellow Sadzaitas, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasinamalites, varikudya rice, nevasinama rights. Welcome to the special report. As I mentioned in my introduction, the Willowgate Scandal was Zimbabwe's first high-profile corruption case after independence. The name Willowgate came from a combination of two words, Watergate and Willowvale. Watergate was the American scandal that forced President Nixon to resign in 1974. And Willowvale is the company that was at the center of the Willowgate Scandal in 1988. At the time, its full name was Willowvale Motor Industries, later renamed Willowvale Mazda Motor Industries. It was a state-owned car assembly plant. By the late 1980s, this company had become so dominant in Zimbabwe's automotive sector because many car dealerships had collapsed under economic pressure. But maybe let's begin from the very start. Let me give you the background first. You see, after independence in 1980, Zimbabwe spent heavily on free education, affordable healthcare, support for farmers, drought relief, food subsidies, the resettlement of ex-combatants and even refugees. The government also tripled school enrollment, which meant that more and more people were now going to school as compared to before independence. Wages and salaries for civil servants were raised, and the government also expanded the army, combining ZIPRA, ZANLA, and the Rhodesian forces. So, as you can tell, the government spent a lot of money including importing a lot of materials to make all these projects a success. And soon, the government was spending more money than it was receiving. The money that Zimbabwe was getting from exports and taxes was no longer enough to cover all the government expenses. So the government started borrowing in order to cover its expenses. Kutora chikweret, chekunokava chimwe chikweret. And on top of that, the Zimbabwean dollar was kept deliberately strong. Now this made imports cheap, but however, it made exports expensive. It was harder to export Zimbabwean products and cheaper to just buy from outside. This created a massive foreign currency shortage. So, by the mid-80s, going into the late 80s, Zimbabwe was in a serious foreign currency crisis. The country could no longer import enough vehicle assembly parts. Many dealerships closed. Willowgate became the main source of new vehicles. But even at Willowgate, production dropped sharply, while demand exploded. Too many buyers, too few cars, a perfect breeding ground for a black market. Government ministers, however, were given priority. They could buy cars with relative ease. Furthermore, these cars were not sold at market value. The government kept the official prices low, creating a perfect opportunity for ministers to buy cheap and sell high. And in case you're wondering why the prices were kept low, well, it's because the Zimbabwean government used price controls to protect consumers during a time of shortages. But the same policy created a massive gap between the controlled price and the real market price. And that's exactly what the naughty ministers exploited. The big wigs, chefs, and senior government officials had turned the waiting list into a lucrative business. A precedent had been set. If the system gives you an advantage, why shouldn't you cash in? Now let's talk about how the scandal came to light. We want to know how it was exposed. The funny thing is, the whole scandal might not have been exposed if it wasn't for one mistake. One simple clerical error exposed everything. So here is how it unfolded. The story begins with Obert Mpofu. At the time, he was the general manager of a ZANU-PF company called Zimbabwe Grain Bag. It was based in Bulawayo. Obert Mpofu received a check from Willowgate Motors. The money was a refund, and yet Mpofu hadn't bought any car. This left him confused. What the hell was happening? So Mpofu called Willowgate Motors to find out why that check had been sent to him. But he didn't get a satisfactory answer. So he decided to go to his friend, Geoff Nyarota, who was then editor of the Chronicle in Bulawayo. The two men had known each other for years, having first met in the early 80s when Obert Mpofu briefly worked for Zim Papers, the parent company of the Chronicle. So Mpofu handed the check to Geoff Nyarota. And Nyarota started digging and digging and digging. Achingo diga, nekungo diga, vanovukura vachivukura, iye achingo diga. And what he discovered was very shocking. So it turns out, the check which Obert Mpofu had received was indeed sent to him by mistake. It was actually meant for a guy called Albert Mpofu. So here is what happened. Alvord Mpofu paid Willowgate Motors for a very expensive Mazda at the time. But she was later told that Willowgate Motors didn't have that particular Mazda in stock. So they instead offered him a cheaper model. They said, since you've already paid a lot of money for that expensive car, which we don't have, we'll give you this cheaper model and refund you the difference. So the refund came in the form of a check. But unfortunately, they sent the check to a wrong Mpofu. Instead of sending it to Alvord Mpofu, they sent it to Obet Mpofu. But what's even worse is that Alvord Mpofu was just an ordinary guy. The vehicle linked to the check that was sent to Obet Mpofu was way above what his ordinary life could afford. In his investigation, Geoff Nyarota discovered that Alvord Mpofu had been assigned by other people to purchase and collect this vehicle on their behalf. So, in today's language, he was a front, and obviously, evidently, clearly, not a patriotic front. Nyarota kept digging and uncovered even more. Government ministers and their deputies, party bigwigs, provincial governors taking advantage of the system. And when the Chronicle finally ran the story, the nation was in shock. Zimbabweans were furious. This wasn't just corruption. It was a betrayal of the liberation promise. And remember, this was 1988, months after the UNITA Accord. The Willowgate Scandal also coincided with the push in ZANU-PF for a one-party state. Edgar Tekere was one of the most vocal critics of not only the people involved in the Willowgate Scandal, but also the ZANU-PF push for a one-party state. Tekere publicly condemned the ministers implicated in Willowgate, accusing ZANU-PF of betraying the revolution and tolerating corruption at the highest levels. That is what led to his fallout with Robert Mugabe, and of course his eventual expulsion from ZANU-PF, later on forming Zoom. Now, let's look at how Robert Mugabe handled the Willowgate Scandal after it got exposed by the Chronicle newspaper. So, under intense public pressure, Robert Mugabe appointed a commission led by Justice Wilson Sandura. Now, the commission summoned ministers and officials to testify under oath. It examined Willowgate's allocation system and investigated abuse of office for profit. The hearings became national drama. Zimbabweans followed each session closely. The commission found that several ministers and senior officials had abused their positions to obtain vehicles and resell them at a profit. The commission was especially critical of one minister, Frederick Shava, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and now Minister of Higher and Tertiary Education. The Sandura Commission said Shava behaved like a proper car dealer. So eventually, 5 ministers resigned out of shame. These were Kalistas Ndlovu, whose ministry was responsible for Willowgate Motors, Frederick Shava, Dzingai Mutumbuka, Maurice Nyagumbo, and Enos Nkala. The current Speaker of Parliament, Jacob Mudenda, was also implicated and resigned. He was at the time Governor of Matabeleland North. It's worth noting that this scandal effectively marked the end of Enos Nkala's political career. He did try a comeback several times, but nothing came out of it. He never really recovered. Remember, Nkala was a founding member of ZANU. In fact, ZANU was formed in Enosinkala's house on the 8th of August 1963 in Highfields. But the saddest story of this scandal was Maurice Nyagumbo, a veteran nationalist who had spent years in colonial prisons alongside Robert Mugabe and others. But after being implicated in the scandal, Nyagumbo resigned. He was later charged with perjury, and in April 1989, he took his own life by drinking poison. But despite the scandal, Maurice Nyagumbo was declared a national hero and was buried at the Heroes Acre, a sign of how complex and contradictory Zimbabwean politics had already become. Now, any normal person, any level-headed person would think that the journalists who exposed this scandal would be celebrated by the system. But instead of being celebrated, Nyarota and Maruziva were removed from their posts at the Chronicle and reassigned to less influential roles. In his book titled Against the Grain, Geoff Nyarota said that when he got removed from the Chronicle, the bosses told him that he and his colleagues had been overzealous in their coverage of the Willowgate Scandal. So clearly, the powers that be were not really happy with that exposure. The Zimbabwe they envisioned was one where you don't expose Madiri Emashef. Papalites always say, touch not the anointed. Well, in politics we say, touch not the connected. Now, people might say, why are we still talking about issues that happened decades ago? The Willowgate Scandal happened in 1988. So why am I bothering you guys with stale news? Well, you see, the Willowgate Scandal was a warning Zimbabwe never heeded. The Willowgate Scandal showed that liberation credentials could shield corruption. It showed that state privileges could be turned into private business. That commissions could expose wrongdoing without fixing the system. But perhaps more importantly, it showed that power would always protect its own. Touch not the connected. So the Willowgate Scandal was just the beginning, an introduction. Because many more scandals, far much more worse, followed. We're talking about the Willowgate Scandal, GMB Scandal, Marange Diamond Scandal, Asiagate Scandal, Salarygate Scandal, Drugsgate Scandal, Gold Mafia Scandal. Even a vice president was involved in a sex scandal. Tingorika Nyika Kema Scandal. The real Scandinavia. Willowgate wasn't the biggest scandal financially, but symbolically it was massive. Less than a decade after independence, Zimbabweans witnessed ministers flipping cars, a national hero taking his own life, journalists getting punished for doing the right thing, and a political system choosing self-protection over reform. Willowgate wasn't just about cars. It was the first clear sign, the first X-ray image of how power, privilege, and impunity would shape Zimbabwean politics for decades to come. So if you want to understand today's corruption, and why catch and release is now a norm, you start here at Willowgate, the warning sign that Zimbabwe never heeded. So when you see tenderpreneurs are taking advantage of the system today, it's because a precedent was already set almost 40 years ago. So, we've covered the Willowgate Scandal. A week ago, we covered ASAP. Which other story from the past do you want me to cover? Let me know in the comment section. Because as you know, I'm always ready to marinate you guys with all the details without fear or favor. Because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.